The Arizona sun burned merciless and white above the small cemetery of Copper Creek, casting harsh shadows between the weathered headstones and wooden crosses that marked the final resting places of those who had tried to tame this unforgiving land. Martha Henderson stood motionless beside the fresh mound of earth, her black mourning dress a stark contrast against the red dust that seemed to coat everything in this god-forsaken territory. Her hands trembled as she clutched the wilted wildflowers she'd picked from what remained of her garden, the same garden Thomas had helped her plant just 3 months ago, back when their biggest worry was whether the creek would run dry before the autumn rains came. Now those flowers lay scattered across his grave like broken promises, their petals already browning in the heat. "Martha, honey, you need to come away from here." Sarah Jenkins, the preacher's wife, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. The older woman's face was creased with concern, her own black bonnet providing little protection from the sun's assault. "The service is over. Folks are waiting to pay their respects back at the church." But Martha couldn't move. Her green eyes, once bright with the hope of building a life in this harsh land, now burned with something darker. She stared at the simple wooden cross that bore her husband's name, carved in Thomas's own careful handwriting just weeks before, a bitter irony that made her stomach twist. 28 years old, she whispered, her voice cracking like dried leather. "We had 28 years together, and those red devils took him from me in 28 seconds. The small gathering of townspeople shifted uncomfortably behind her. Sheriff Samuel Creek, a tall man with graying temples and kind eyes, stepped forward cautiously. "Now, Martha, we don't know exactly what happened out there. The tracks were—" "I know exactly what happened." Martha spun around, her auburn hair whipping free from its severe bun. Her face was streaked with tears and dust, but her voice carried across the cemetery like a whip crack. "Apache raiders came to our ranch. They killed my husband. They burned our barn. They stole our horses." She turned back to the grave, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles were white. "And now Thomas lies here in the ground while they're out there, free as the wind, probably planning their next murder." From the rocky hills that surrounded Copper Creek's small cemetery, Ayanna watched the white woman's grief transform into rage. His bronze face remained impassive, but his dark eyes reflected something deeper, a pain that matched her own, though for different reasons. He lay flat against the sun-warmed stone, his buckskin clothing blending perfectly with the desert landscape, making him invisible to the mourners below. He had been tracking the same men who killed Thomas Henderson for over a week now. White men with bounty scalps hanging from their belts, men who cared nothing for Apache or white blood as long as it brought them profit. But how could he tell this grieving woman that her husband had died not as a victim of Apache violence, but as a hero protecting Apache children from those very killers? Martha's voice rose again, carrying clearly to his hiding place. "I curse them!" she shouted at the sky, her arms raised toward the merciless sun. "I curse every Apache who draws breath in this territory. May they know the same pain they've brought to me. May they lose everything they hold dear, just as I have." The words hit Ayanna like physical blows. He had heard such curses before. They were as common in this land as scorpions and rattlesnakes. But something about this woman's raw anguish made them different. She wasn't speaking from hatred alone, but from a love so deep that its loss had transformed her into something she didn't recognize. Sheriff Creek was trying to calm her now, his voice a low murmur that didn't carry to the hills. The other townspeople were backing away, uncomfortable with the intensity of her emotion. In frontier towns like Copper Creek, grief was expected to be private, controlled, a luxury this harsh land rarely afforded. But Martha wasn't finished. She knelt beside the grave and pressed her palms flat against the disturbed earth. "I swear to you, Thomas," she whispered, though her words were loud enough for Ayanna to hear every syllable, "I will not rest until every one of those murdering savages pays for what they did to you. I will see them driven from this land or buried in it." As she spoke, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the desert silence. To the townspeople below, it was just another sound of the wilderness. But to Ayanna, it was a reminder of the old stories, how the spirits of the dead sometimes lingered near places of great sorrow, waiting for justice to be done. He watched as Martha finally allowed herself to be led away from the grave, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. The other mourners followed at a respectful distance, leaving the cemetery empty, except for the wind-carved monuments and the terrible weight of words that could not be taken back. When the last mourner disappeared around the bend toward town, Ayanna rose from his hiding place and made his way down the rocky slope. His moccasined feet made no sound on the stone and scrub brush. At the edge of the cemetery, he paused. Thomas Henderson's grave lay before him, marked by that simple wooden cross and surrounded by wilted wildflowers. Ayanna reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object, a carved wooden eagle, no bigger than his thumb, that Thomas had made for one of the Apache children just hours before his death. The white rancher had been teaching the boy how to whittle, showing him the grain of the wood and the proper way to use a knife. When the bounty hunters appeared, Thomas had pushed the children behind his barn and faced the killers alone, giving the young ones time to escape into the desert. "Your woman speaks from pain," Ayanna said quietly to the grave, placing the tiny eagle among the scattered flowers. "But pain can make truth from lies or lies from truth. She will learn which, as we all must." The wind picked up, stirring the dust around the cemetery and carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Ayanna looked toward the town where smoke was rising from chimneys, where Martha Henderson was probably sitting in the preacher's parlor, accepting condolences and trying to figure out how a woman alone was supposed to survive on a ranch in Apache country. She would learn soon enough that survival in this land had nothing to do with the color of one's skin, and everything to do with the choices made when everything seemed lost. The same men who had killed her husband were still out there, and they wouldn't stop with one ranch, one family, one life. As Ayanna melted back into the landscape like morning mist, Martha's curse echoed in his memory. Words spoken in grief had power in this ancient land, but so did actions taken in the name of what was right. The truth would find its way to her, as truth always did in the desert, harsh, unforgiving, but pure as the light that burned everything false away. 3 weeks had passed since Thomas Henderson was buried in Copper Creek's windswept cemetery, and Martha was learning that grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. The ranch demanded her attention whether her heart was broken or not. Cattle needed water, fences needed mending, and the predators that circled wounded things had already begun to close in. She stood on the front porch of her modest adobe house in the pre-dawn darkness, a cup of bitter coffee warming her hands as she watched the sun slowly paint the distant mesas red and gold. The silence was different now. Before, it had been peaceful, the comfortable quiet of a home shared with someone who understood that some thoughts didn't need words. Now it pressed against her like a weight, filled with all the conversations she would never have again. The burned skeleton of their barn stood stark against the morning sky, its blackened timbers a constant reminder of the night that changed everything. She'd found Thomas's body there, and for 3 weeks she'd been unable to bring herself to clear the wreckage. Some mornings she caught herself setting 2 cups on the kitchen table before remembering. A sound from the corral made her look up, her remaining horses shifting restlessly, ears pricked toward the desert. Martha set down her coffee and reached for the Winchester rifle that now lived within arm's reach wherever she went. In the growing light, she could see nothing moving beyond the fence line, but the horse's nervous energy told her something was out there. "Easy, Buttercup," she murmured to her mare, a golden palomino that Thomas had gentled himself. Just coyotes, probably. But even as she spoke, Martha knew it wasn't coyotes. Coyotes didn't make horses act like that. Apache did. The thought sent a familiar surge of hot anger through her chest. Every shadow could be hiding painted faces. Every sound of wind through the sage might be moccasined feet. She'd been living like this for 3 weeks now, starting at every noise, sleeping with the rifle beside her bed, jumping when her own reflection moved in the window glass. "Mrs. Henderson," a voice called from beyond the corral, making her spin with the rifle halfway to her shoulder. "It's Jake Morrison. Mind if I ride in?" Martha lowered the weapon but kept it ready. Jake Morrison was one of the men who'd been sniffing around since Thomas's funeral, not offering help so much as measuring what was left unguarded. He was a hard-faced man with pale eyes and a reputation for taking what he wanted, whether it was land, cattle, or women. "What do you want, Morrison?" she called back, not moving from the porch. He rode into the yard on a big bay stallion, his spurs jangling with each step. Behind him came 2 other men she recognized from the saloons in town, Pete Hawkins and Dutch Miller, both known for hiring their guns to whoever paid best. All 3 wore the kind of weapons that were meant for killing men, not hunting game. "Now, that's no way to greet neighbors," Morrison said with a smile that never reached his eyes. He touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. "Especially neighbors who come bearing good news. I don't recall inviting you onto my property." "About that," Morrison swung down from his saddle with practiced ease. "See, that's what we came to talk about, this property. You being out here all alone, trying to work a ranch that was barely manageable with 2 people. He gestured toward the burned barn, And after what happened to poor Tom, well, seems to me you'd want to cut your losses before something worse happens. Martha's grip tightened on the rifle. Thomas, his name was Thomas, and nothing's going to happen to me. Course not, Pete Hawkins spoke up, his voice oily with false concern. But you got to think practical like. Woman alone, Apache country, winter coming on. Wouldn't be Christian for us to let you struggle out here when we could take this burden off your hands. For a fair price, naturally, Dutch added, though his definition of fair was probably very different from Martha's. From his vantage point on a ridge 300 yards away, Ayana watched the scene unfold through the growing morning light. He'd been tracking these three men for 2 days now, ever since they'd left a trail of burned homesteads and missing women across the territory. They weren't bounty hunters like the ones who killed Thomas Henderson. They were something worse. Land grabbers who used Apache raids as cover for their own violence, then swooped in to buy property cheap from terrified survivors. The White Widow stood alone on her porch, facing 3 armed men with nothing but an old rifle and the kind of stubborn courage that got people killed in this country. Ayana had seen it before. Settlers who refused to run when running was the only smart choice, who held onto their land with both hands even as it burned around them. But this woman was different. She carried herself like someone who'd already lost everything that mattered, which made her dangerous in a way these men didn't understand. A person with nothing left to lose was capable of almost anything. I'm not selling, Martha said, her voice carrying clearly across the morning air. Not to you, not to anybody. This ranch was Thomas's dream, and I'm going to hold on to it. Morrison's false smile faded. Now, Martha, you don't mind if I call you Martha. You need to be reasonable here. Winter's coming and you got no hired help, no family to fall back on. How you planning to get through till spring? I'll manage. Will you now? Morrison took a step closer to the porch, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. See, word around town is you've been having troubles. Fences cut, waterholes fouled, cattle wandering off. Seems like them Apache are still mighty interested in this particular piece of land. Martha's face went pale, but her voice stayed steady. If you know something about my troubles, Morrison, maybe you ought to talk to Sheriff Creek about it. Oh, Sam Creek's a good man, but he's got his hands full keeping the peace in town. Can't be riding out to every ranch every time somebody's got a problem with Indians. Morrison's companions had spread out slightly, flanking the porch in a way that looked casual but wasn't. Now, what if I told you I could make them problems go away? For a reasonable price, of course. The implications hung in the desert air like smoke. Morrison wasn't just offering to buy her land. He was admitting to being the source of her recent troubles and threatening worse if she didn't comply. Ayana had heard enough. These men weren't going to leave without getting what they came for one way or another. The widow might have courage, but courage wouldn't stop 3 bullets. He began working his way down the ridge, using the broken terrain and scattered boulders for cover. His movements were silent, practiced, the skills learned from a lifetime of hunting and being hunted in this harsh land. Back at the ranch, Martha was backing slowly toward her front door, the rifle still in her hands but not yet raised. Get off my land, Morrison, all of you, now. Or what? Pete Hawkins laughed, a sound like grinding stone. You gonna shoot all 3 of us, little lady? You even know how to use that old buffalo gun? Thomas taught me, Martha said, and for the first time her voice carried the hard edge of absolute truth. Said I might need to defend what's mine someday. Morrison's expression darkened. Tom Henderson was a fool who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. Look where it got him, burned up in his own barn by the very savages he was trying to protect. The words hit Martha like a physical blow. What did you say? Nothing, Morrison said quickly, but it was too late. His slip had revealed more than he intended. Martha raised the rifle, her hands suddenly steady. You said Thomas was protecting savages. How would you know that unless— Understanding dawned in her green eyes, cold and terrible. Unless you were there. The 3 men reached for their guns, but Martha's rifle was already moving. The Winchester cracked like thunder in the morning stillness, and Pete Hawkins spun backward, clutching his shoulder and screaming curses. But before Morrison or Dutch could clear leather, another sound split the air, the whistle of an arrow taking flight. Dutch Miller staggered, looking down in shock at the feathered shaft protruding from his gun arm. Ayana rose from behind a boulder 20 yards away, another arrow already knocked to his bowstring. In the morning light, he looked like something carved from the desert itself. Bronze skin, dark hair bound with leather and feathers, muscles coiled with the easy power of a natural predator. The woman said, "Leave," he called out in accented but clear English. Maybe you should listen. Morrison spun toward this new threat, his gun half-drawn, caught between the rifle-wielding widow and the Apache warrior, who'd appeared like something out of a nightmare. "Apache!" he snarled, and Martha felt her own world tilt on its axis. The very people she'd cursed at Thomas's grave, one of them was here now defending her ranch, but there was no time for questions. Morrison's gun was coming up, and Martha knew with terrible clarity that the next few seconds would determine whether she lived to see another sunset in this unforgiving land. Time seemed frozen in the harsh morning light, like a photograph capturing the moment before everything changed forever. Martha Henderson stood on her porch with the Winchester still smoking in her hands, staring at the Apache warrior who had just saved her life. Jake Morrison crouched behind his wounded horse, his gun trained not on the Indian, but on Martha herself, his face twisted with desperate fury. "You stupid woman," Morrison snarled, his voice cracking with panic. "You just signed your own death warrant. That red devil ain't here to help you. He's here to finish what his people started." But Ayanna's dark eyes never left Morrison's face, and when he spoke, his voice carried the calm certainty of a man stating simple facts. Jake Morrison, the man who burns ranches and blames Apache, the man who kills children and calls it justice. His bowstring remained taut, the arrow aimed at Morrison's heart. Thomas Henderson died because he would not let you murder innocents. Martha's world tilted again, the rifle wavering in her suddenly unsteady hands. What are you talking about?" "Your husband found us first," Ayanna continued, his gaze never wavering from Morrison. "My nephew, my sister's children, hiding in your barn because these men hunt Apache for bounty money. $2 for every scalp, no questions asked about age or guilt." Pete Hawkins was still groaning and clutching his wounded shoulder, but Dutch Miller had managed to pull the arrow from his gun arm and was reaching for a backup pistol with his left hand. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, and the desert would claim them all. "You're lying," Martha shouted, but her voice carried more desperation than conviction. "Thomas would have told me if there were Apache children on our ranch." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Tell you? Hell, woman. Your precious Thomas didn't just hide them savages, he fed them, doctored them, treated them like they was his own kin, said it wasn't Christian to let children suffer, no matter what color they was." The words hit Martha like physical blows. She remembered the extra food that had been disappearing from their stores, the way Thomas had been spending long hours in the barn, working on projects he wouldn't discuss. She'd thought he was building furniture for the baby they'd been trying to have. "3 Apache children," Ayanna said, his voice gentler now but still carrying across the yard like a knife through silence, "wounded in a raid on their village. Your husband found them, brought them to safety, kept them hidden while they healed." "That's impossible," Martha whispered, but even as she spoke she was remembering other things. The small moccasins she'd found behind the barn and assumed belonged to some traveling Indian trader. The children's drawings scratched in the dirt near the corral, stick figures of horses and birds that she'd thought were made by the wind. Dutch Miller's backup gun was almost clear of its holster when Ayanna's second arrow took him through the chest, spinning him backward into the dust. He hit the ground hard and didn't move again. Morrison fired wildly, his bullet splintering wood inches from Martha's head. She dropped to one knee and worked the Winchester's lever, sending another round into the chamber, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the weapon. "When Morrison came that night," Ayanna continued, advancing slowly toward the remaining gunman, "Thomas told the children to run. He faced these killers alone, with only an old hunting rifle to give them time to escape." "Shut up!" Morrison screamed, firing again. This bullet went wide, kicking up dust near Ayanna's feet. "Shut your lying mouth." But the Apache warrior kept talking, his voice cutting through Morrison's panic like truth through lies. "He did not die in a raid, Martha Henderson. He died protecting children who had no one else to protect them. He died because he believed some things are worth dying for." Martha's rifle found its target this time, the bullet taking Morrison in the shoulder and spinning him around. He dropped his gun and fell to his knees, clutching the wound and cursing everything he could think of: the desert, the Apache, the stubborn woman who should have sold her ranch and disappeared like a sensible person. Pete Hawkins had stopped groaning and was trying to crawl toward his dropped pistol, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. Ayanna's third arrow ended that effort permanently. Sudden silence fell over the ranch yard, broken only by Morrison's labored breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Martha stood slowly, her legs shaking, the rifle still pointed at the wounded man who had just destroyed everything she thought she knew about her husband's death. "The children," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where are they now?" "Safe," Ayana replied, lowering his bow for the first time since appearing. "With my people, learning to be children again, instead of ghosts." Morrison spat blood into the dust. "You think this changes anything? You think knowing Tom was an Indian lover makes you feel better about him being dead?" He looked up at Martha with eyes full of malice. "There's more of us coming, woman. More men who know there's money to be made in this territory, and plenty of Apache scalps still walking around with hair attached." Martha walked down from the porch, her boots crunching on the gravel, until she stood directly over the wounded man. "You killed my husband." "I killed a traitor," Morrison shot back. "A white man who chose savages over his own kind." The rifle butt caught him across the temple, dropping him unconscious into the dirt. Martha stood over his still form, breathing hard, her green eyes bright with unshed tears and a fury that had finally found its proper target. "He chose what was right," she said to the unconscious man. "Something you wouldn't understand." Ayana approached slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. Up close, Martha could see the laugh lines around his dark eyes, the careful way he held himself, not like a savage, but like a man carrying burdens he'd rather not bear. "Your husband spoke of you," he said quietly. "Said you had the strongest heart of any woman he'd ever known. Said you would understand when the time came, why he did what he did." Martha looked around the ranch yard, taking in the bodies, the blood, the evidence of violence that seemed to follow her wherever she went in this harsh land. "I don't understand anything anymore," she admitted. 3 weeks ago I thought I knew who the enemy was. Now you know the truth," Ayana finished. "That good and evil are not determined by the color of a man's skin, but by the choices he makes when others are depending on him." A sound from the direction of town made them both look up. Dust cloud on the horizon, riders coming fast. Martha felt a familiar surge of panic. More trouble, more violence, more death in this endless cycle of hatred and revenge. But Ayana was already moving toward his horse, hidden in a stand of mesquite beyond the corral. "Sheriff Creek comes with a posse," he said, reading the distant signs with eyes trained by a lifetime in the desert. "They will ask questions you cannot answer truthfully without bringing more trouble to your door." "Wait," Martha called after him. "I don't even know your name." He paused, one hand on his horse's bridle. "I am called Ayana. It means eternal blossom in my language, something that grows even in the hardest ground. Why did you help me? After what I said at the cemetery? After I cursed your people?" Ayana swung up onto his horse with fluid grace, looking down at her with something that might have been compassion. "Because your husband asked me to watch over you, if anything happened to him. Because cursing the darkness is easier than lighting a candle. And because some promises are worth keeping, even when they're made to dead men." He rode toward the desert, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that glittered like gold in the morning sun. At the edge of the cleared land, he turned back one final time. "The truth will find you again, Martha Henderson," he called across the distance. "When it does, remember that your husband died for something larger than himself. Remember that hatred is a choice, just like love." Then he was gone, melting into the landscape like morning mist, leaving Martha alone with 3 dead men and a truth that changed everything she thought she knew about justice, love, and the cost of doing what was right in a world that rarely rewarded such choices. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Martha Henderson began the difficult task of deciding which version of the truth she was prepared to tell. Sheriff Samuel Creek reined in his lathered horse at the edge of Martha Henderson's ranch yard, his weathered face grim as he took in the scene before him. 3 bodies lay sprawled in the dust, blood already darkening to rust in the harsh desert sun. Martha stood beside her porch like a statue, carved from determination and grief, the Winchester rifle still clutched in her white-knuckled hands. Behind Creek rode 4 townsmen hastily deputized when word reached Copper Creek about gunshots at the Henderson place. Tom Bradley, the bank manager, looked green around the gills at the sight of so much death. Doc Patterson was already dismounting, his medical bag in hand, despite the obvious fact that his services wouldn't be needed for the fallen men. "Martha," Creek said carefully, his hand resting on his gun butt more from habit than suspicion. "You hurt?" "No," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But I can't say the same for them." Creek walked his horse closer, studying the bodies with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen his share of frontier violence. Jake Morrison lay unconscious, blood seeping from a head wound and a bullet hole in his shoulder. Pete Hawkins and Dutch Miller would never see another sunrise. "What happened here?" Creek asked, though he was already forming his own theories based on the evidence scattered across the yard. Martha looked at the sheriff, a good man who'd been Thomas's friend, who'd stood beside her at the funeral and offered his help in the difficult weeks that followed. Now she had to decide how much truth a good man could handle in a territory where the wrong words could start a war. "Morrison came here with his men," she began, choosing each word carefully. "Said they wanted to buy the ranch. When I refused, they made it clear the offer wasn't optional." Creek nodded grimly. He'd been expecting something like this. Vultures always circled when a woman was left alone on valuable land. "So you defended yourself. Good for you, Martha. Though I got to ask, how'd you manage to take down 3 armed men by yourself?" Here was the moment of truth. Martha glanced toward the desert where Ayanna had disappeared, then back at Creek's honest face. The easy lie would be to claim she'd gotten lucky, that Morrison's men had underestimated her. But the truth was more complicated, and complications in Apache country had a way of getting people killed. "I had help," she said finally. "Help?" Creek's eyebrows rose. "From who? Didn't see any other horses when we rode up." Martha set down the rifle and walked to where Dutch Miller's body lay beside an Apache arrow shaft. She picked up the feathered projectile, its obsidian point still sharp enough to shave with. Apache. The effect of that single word was like dropping a lit match into a powder keg. Tom Bradley cursed and reached for his gun. Doc Patterson stopped examining Morrison's wounds and looked up in alarm. The other deputies spread out instinctively, scanning the horizon for painted faces and hostile movement. "Apache," Creek repeated, his voice tight with the kind of controlled tension that kept frontier lawmen alive. "Martha, you sure about that?" "I'm sure." She held up the arrow, letting them all see the distinctive craftsmanship. "Morrison said something he shouldn't have, something about Thomas dying while protecting savages. When I realized what he meant, that Morrison and his men were there the night Thomas was killed, things got violent fast." Creek's face went pale beneath his sunburned skin. "You saying Morrison killed Thomas?" "I'm saying Morrison knew more about that night than any honest man should." Martha's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "And when I started asking the right questions, his men went for their guns." "But an Apache helped you?" Tom Bradley sputtered, his banker's mind struggling to process information that didn't fit his worldview. "Why would an Apache help a white woman?" Martha looked at the arrow again, remembering Ayanna's words about her husband asking him to watch over her. "Maybe because not everything in this world is as simple as we want it to be." Creek was studying Morrison's unconscious form with new interest. Jake Morrison had been operating in the territory for over a year, always seeming to show up at ranches shortly after Apache raids, offering to buy property from desperate or grieving families. Creek had never liked the man, but he'd never had evidence of actual wrongdoing. "You think Morrison's been staging raids?" Creek asked quietly. "Killing folks and blaming it on Apache?" "I think Morrison's been doing whatever it takes to get his hands on prime ranch land," Martha replied, "and I think Thomas found out about it." Doc Patterson looked up from his examination of Morrison's wounds. "This man's got a concussion, but he'll live to stand trial if that's what you're planning, Sam." Creek nodded slowly. A trial would mean questions, investigations, testimony that might reveal uncomfortable truths about how the Apache had been blamed for crimes they didn't commit. In a territory where the line between civilization and chaos was measured in bullet calibers, such revelations could upset the careful balance that kept settlements from turning into graveyards. "Martha," Creek said carefully, "I need to know exactly what happened here. Every detail. Because if word gets out that you were helped by Apache, there's folks in town who might not see it the way you do." She understood the warning. There were men in Copper Creek who would see her cooperation with an Apache as treason, regardless of the circumstances. Men who believed the only good Indian was a dead Indian, and who might extend that philosophy to white women who thought differently. "The Apache warrior appeared when Morrison's men drew their guns," Martha said, sticking as close to the literal truth as possible. "He probably saved my life. When it was over, he rode away. I never saw him before, and I don't expect to see him again." It wasn't quite a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. She couldn't tell them that Ayanna had known Thomas, had been present at the hidden drama that led to her husband's death, had made a promise to a dying man to protect his widow. Such knowledge would raise too many questions she wasn't ready to answer. Creek studied her face with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read truth and lies in equal measure. After a long moment, he nodded. "We'll take Morrison back to town, see what he has to say when he wakes up. As for his partners," he gestured at the 2 dead men. "Self-defense is clear enough. No jury in the territory would convict a woman for protecting her home. But as they loaded Morrison's unconscious form onto the back of a horse and prepared to head back to town, Martha caught Creek looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was the look of a man who suspected there was more to the story, but who wasn't sure he wanted to know what it was. "Martha," he said as he prepared to mount up, "you might want to consider Tom Bradley's offer about selling this place. After what happened here today, word's going to spread. Some folks might get ideas about Apache being welcome on your land." "Let them get ideas," Martha replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "This is my home. Thomas died for it, and I'm not running away just because some people can't tell the difference between right and wrong." Creek tipped his hat to her, but his eyes remained troubled. "Just be careful. Truth has a way of being more dangerous than lies in country like this." As the sheriff's party rode away with their prisoner and their dead, Martha stood alone in her ranch yard, watching the dust settle. The silence that followed their departure was different from the oppressive quiet of the past 3 weeks. It was the silence of a woman who had finally learned to distinguish between enemies and allies, regardless of what color skin they wore. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the desert and the first stars appeared in the vast Arizona sky, Martha found herself standing at the edge of her property, looking toward the distant mountains where Ayanna had disappeared. She held Thomas's old spyglass in her hands, the same instrument he'd used to watch for weather and wildlife and the 1,000 small signs that meant the difference between prosperity and disaster in this unforgiving land. Somewhere out there was a man who had kept a promise to her dead husband, who had saved her life, despite having every reason to hate her for the curse she'd spoken at Thomas's grave. Somewhere out there was the truth about courage and redemption that her husband had died trying to prove. And somewhere out there, she was beginning to understand, was the answer to the question that had been haunting her since that terrible night 3 weeks ago. How to honor the dead while still finding a way to live among the living. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Martha Henderson turned back toward her house, toward the difficult work of rebuilding a life that could accommodate truths she'd never imagined, in a land that rarely forgave the mistakes of those who learned wisdom too late. But for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something other than anger burning in her chest. It wasn't happiness. That would take time, if it came at all. It was something smaller but more durable. The possibility that justice might be more complicated than revenge, and that healing might be possible even in the hardest ground. 2 weeks after Jake Morrison was hauled away to face territorial justice, Martha Henderson stood at the edge of Red Canyon, her heart pounding with something that had nothing to do with the treacherous climb down the rocky trail. The canyon walls rose around her like the ribs of some ancient beast, their red sandstone surfaces painted with the gold and purple shadows of late afternoon. She'd come here following cattle tracks. 3 of her best steers had wandered off during the night, and their trail led straight into this maze of stone and shadow. But cattle weren't the only thing she'd been tracking. For 3 days now, she'd caught glimpses of smoke in the distance, seen the signs of other riders moving through the desert with purposes she could only guess at. Morrison's arrest had sent ripples through the criminal network that had been using Apache raids as cover for their activities, and those ripples were starting to crash back onto shore. Martha's Winchester rested easy in her hands now, no longer the desperate lifeline it had been during those first terrifying weeks alone. She'd learned to read the desert's moods, to distinguish between the sounds that meant danger and those that simply meant life continuing its ancient rhythms in this harsh land. The knowledge had come at a price: sleepless nights, constant vigilance, the bone-deep understanding that safety was always temporary in Apache country. The cattle tracks led deeper into the canyon, following what had once been a stream bed, but was now just cracked earth and scattered stones. Martha moved carefully, her boots finding purchase on the uneven ground, while her eyes scanned the towering walls above for any sign of movement. Red Canyon was known for its hidden passages and unexpected dead ends, a place where the unwary could easily become lost or trapped. A sound echoed off the canyon walls, not the lowing of cattle, but something sharper, more urgent. Voices carried on the wind and distorted by echoes until she couldn't tell if they were speaking English or Apache or some other language entirely. Martha pressed herself against the canyon wall and listened, trying to determine direction and distance. There, movement on a ledge perhaps 50 feet above her head, 2 figures in buckskin and calico, moving with the careful deliberation of people trying not to be seen. Not Apache, she realized after a moment's observation. The way they moved was wrong, too clumsy, too obvious. White men dressed as Indians, probably part of whatever remained of Morrison's operation. The realization sent ice through her veins. If Morrison's partners were still active, still using Apache disguises to cover their crimes, then her interference in their plans had marked her for death. They'd probably driven her cattle into the canyon as bait, counting on her following to try to recover her property. She was trapped. The narrow trail behind her offered no cover, and the canyon ahead was almost certainly an ambush. Martha checked her rifle and counted her ammunition. 18 rounds in the Winchester, 6 more in her revolver. Against how many enemies? And in terrain that favored anyone with the high ground? Mrs. Henderson. The voice came from above and behind her, calm and familiar despite the echoing acoustics of the canyon. Move away from the wall, quickly. Ayanna. Martha looked up and saw him balanced on a narrow ledge, his bow in his hands, and an expression of focused concentration on his bronze face. He wasn't looking at her, but at something further up the canyon, something she couldn't see from her position on the canyon floor. She moved away from the wall just as a rifle cracked from somewhere above, the bullet chipping stone where her head had been a moment before. The sound echoed and re-echoed through the canyon until it seemed like an entire army was shooting at them. "This way," Ayanna called, already moving along the ledge with the sure-footed grace of a mountain goat. "There is a path up." Martha ran, her boots slipping on loose gravel, as more shots rang out from the hidden marksman above. She could see the path now, a narrow crack in the canyon wall that looked like it had been carved by centuries of flash floods. It was steep, treacherous, and completely exposed to gunfire from above, but it was the only way out of the trap. "How many?" she gasped as she began climbing, her rifle slung across her back and her hands searching for handholds in the red stone. "4 that I have seen," Ayanna replied from above. "Morrison's men, but not Apache despite their dress. They move like white men who learned their woodcraft from dime novels." A bullet whined off the rock near Martha's shoulder, and she pressed herself against the stone face, breathing hard. "They're trying to kill us both." "Yes," Ayanna said with the matter-of-fact tone of a man stating the obvious. "But they think like white men, direct, brutal, impatient. They do not understand that the canyon has its own weapons for those who know how to use them." He disappeared over the rim of the ledge above her, and for a moment Martha was alone on the rock face, with only the sound of her own labored breathing and the distant echoes of pursuit. Then his hand appeared, reaching down to help her up the final few feet. The ledge was barely wide enough for 2 people, carved from the canyon wall by wind and water over countless generations. From this vantage point, Martha could see the trap that had been laid for her. 4 men positioned at strategic points around the canyon's rim, armed with rifles and dressed in a crude approximation of Apache clothing that might fool someone at a distance, but wouldn't survive close examination. "They killed the cattle," Ayanna observed, pointing to where her 3 steers lay sprawled near a waterhole at the canyon's bottom. "Used them as bait to draw you here." "Why?" Martha asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Because you can identify Morrison, because you know the truth about what happened to your husband, because you are a threat to men who profit from lies." Ayanna's dark eyes met hers. "And because they think killing you here, dressed as Apache, will start the war they need to cover their other crimes." The implications were staggering. If Martha Henderson's body was found in Red Canyon, apparently killed by Apache raiders, it would inflame anti-Indian sentiment throughout the territory. The army would be called in, Apache bands would be hunted down indiscriminately, and in the chaos that followed, men like Morrison could operate with complete impunity. "How do we stop them?" Martha asked. Ayanna was already moving along the ledge, his moccasined feet silent on the stone. "We use what the canyon gives us," he said. "Sound, shadow, and the white man's fear of what he does not understand." What followed was unlike any battle Martha had ever imagined. There were no cavalry charges, no dramatic gunfights, no heroes standing tall against impossible odds. Instead, there was patience, cunning, and an intimate knowledge of how sound traveled through the labyrinth of stone passages. Ayanna had Martha position herself at a point where her voice would echo through multiple passages, making it impossible to determine her exact location. On his signal, she began calling out in a high, clear voice, not words, but the kind of ululating war cry she'd heard in her nightmares about Apache raids. The effect on the hidden gunmen was immediate and devastating. Shots rang out from multiple directions as they fired at echoes and shadows, their carefully planned ambush dissolving into panicked confusion. Ayanna moved like a ghost through the maze of stone, using the acoustics of the canyon to appear everywhere and nowhere at once. By the time the sun touched the western rim of Red Canyon, 3 of the 4 impostors lay dead among the rocks, their disguises fooling no one in death. The 4th, a thin man with nervous eyes and shaking hands, found himself looking down the barrel of Martha's Winchester, while Ayana's knife rested against his throat. "Please," the man gasped, his fake war paint streaked with sweat and terror. "I was just following orders. Morrison, he paid us to murder an innocent woman and blame it on Apache," Martha finished coldly. "To start a war that would get hundreds of people killed." The man nodded frantically, his eyes darting between Martha's rifle and Ayana's impassive face. "We wasn't going to hurt nobody else, just you, and only because you was causing trouble for the operation." "What operation?" Ayana asked, his voice soft as silk and twice as dangerous. The story that spilled out was worse than Martha had imagined. Morrison's group wasn't just stealing land. They were part of a larger network that stretched across 3 territories, using fake Apache raids to terrorize settlers, steal property, and create the kind of chaos that made enormous profits possible for men without consciences. They had been operating for over 2 years, leaving a trail of burned ranches, murdered families, and inflamed racial hatred that would take generations to heal. Thomas Henderson had stumbled onto their operation by accident, and his death had been designed to look like just another Apache atrocity in a region already torn by violence and suspicion. When the confession was finished, Martha found herself staring at the trembling man with something approaching pity. He was a tool, nothing more, a weak, greedy fool who had allowed himself to be used by stronger, more ruthless men. "What do we do with him?" she asked Ayana. The Apache warrior studied the prisoner for a long moment. "We give him to Sheriff Creek, along with his confession and the evidence of what these men were planning. Let white man's justice decide his fate." "And if Creek doesn't believe us?" Ayana smiled, an expression that held no warmth but considerable satisfaction. "Then we make sure the territorial governor hears the truth." Morrison's arrest has already started people asking questions. This man's testimony will provide the answers they seek. As they prepared to leave Red Canyon with their prisoner, Martha found herself walking beside Ayana in comfortable silence. The crisis was over, the immediate danger past, but she sensed that something larger was ending as well, some chapter in both their lives that could never be repeated. "I never thanked you," she said finally, "for saving my life, for telling me the truth about Thomas, for keeping whatever promise you made to him." "No thanks are needed," Ayana replied. "Your husband was a good man who died for good reasons. Honoring such a man honors us all." They reached the canyon rim as the last light faded from the western sky. Below them, Red Canyon stretched away into purple shadows, its secrets hidden once again in the labyrinth of stone and time. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the vast Arizona sky. "What happens now?" Martha asked. Ayana looked toward the distant mountains where his people waited, then back at the white woman, who had learned to see past the color of a man's skin to the character of his heart. "Now you rebuild your ranch. You live the life your husband wanted you to live. You remember that hatred is a choice and choose differently. And you? I return to my people and tell them that not all white eyes are enemies, just as not all Apache are friends. I tell them that Thomas Henderson's woman learned to see with her husband's eyes, and that perhaps there is hope for peace in this hard land after all." Martha extended her hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. Ayana took it, his calloused palm warm against hers. "Maybe our paths will cross again," she said. "Perhaps," he replied. "This is a small territory, and the wise learn to value their allies wherever they find them." As Ayana disappeared into the desert night, and Martha began the long ride back to her ranch with her prisoner, she found herself thinking about the promise that Red Canyon had extracted from her. Not the promise she'd made to anyone else, but the one she'd made to herself. She would rebuild, but not just the ranch. She would rebuild her understanding of what it meant to be a human being in a world where the line between civilization and savagery had nothing to do with race and everything to do with the choices people made when they thought no one was watching. Thomas had died protecting children who weren't his own, from people who shared his skin color but not his values. Ayana had risked his life to save a woman who had cursed his people because he'd given his word to a dead man who'd earned his respect. These were the truths that mattered, not the color of skin or the accident of birth, but the content of character revealed when everything else was stripped away. Martha Henderson rode home through the star-filled desert night, no longer the bitter widow who had cursed the Apache at her husband's grave, but a woman who had learned that redemption was possible even in the hardest ground, and that love in all its forms was always worth fighting for. Behind her, Red Canyon kept its eternal watch over the desert, its red walls holding the secrets of all those who had found wisdom in its shadowed depths, and its silence promising that some truths once learned could never be forgotten.